Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for coming today. We're going to share our experiences reaching out to the Asian community at farmers markets in Vancouver here today. In 2016, VFM received funding from the government through Investment Agriculture Foundation for a program we called Local Food Global Flavours. The program aimed to increase sales of BC-grown world crops at 3 of our market locations. We also hope to encourage more Asian community members to shop at Vancouver Farmers Markets. So we chose 3 markets where we thought we needed promotional support, and of course that the BC Buy Local funding was about marketing and about exposing more people to BC-grown food. And the surrounding neighborhoods of the 3 markets that we chose, our Trout Lake, Mount Pleasant, and Main Street locations, had a large proportion of Asian community members. So we're going to start with the current state of the markets and our community. So as you can see, quite a gap in what we found to be the mix of the market versus the mix of our community. 43% of Metro Vancouver is of Asian heritage, 43% of the population, and only 14% of our farmers markets shoppers claim Asian heritage. Now this data is from the 2011 census. 2016 census is coming, the information is slowly coming out, but this is the most recent data that we have. And our survey data was from 2013 at all of our markets. So basically, according to the 2011 census, 150 languages are spoken in Vancouver, and 44% of the population are immigrants. These numbers have been steadily growing. And as we know, Canada is a country of immigrants. 20% of our population, according to the census, were foreign-born, the highest proportion of any of the G8 countries. And Asia, including the Middle East, is the origin of the majority of the immigrants to Canada. In Vancouver, as we've measured it, some of our markets are up to 80% of the shopper base identifies as Caucasian. We couldn't help but see that there was work to be done here. 9 out of 10 newcomers to BC are from outside of North America, and 70% of those immigrants are from Asia. Metro Vancouver is home to the largest immigrant population in the country at 913,000 people. Then that makes up 40% of the total population of Metro Vancouver. At Vancouver Farmers Markets, we often compare ourselves to Portland and Seattle because the cities themselves are relatively similar size. In Seattle, the Asian population is 13%, and in Portland, it's just 8%. So we differ greatly between those cities in terms of Asian population. So we decided to divide our approach into 3 main areas: welcome, educate, and grow. So welcome for us meant to provide a welcoming environment for shoppers and people from other cultures. Obviously, it's hard to have things at the market that appeal to certain cultures if you don't have those cultures already represented at the market. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. We try to encourage our vendors to grow crops that they're familiar with and that they might be from their own culture. So our Asian, South Asian vendors have crops that they grow for themselves sometimes, and they don't market them. We asked them, maybe they could try marketing those crops. Obviously, many cultures use the standard crops, carrots, onions, peppers, and other common market crops. So we know we had those covered. And of course, Chinese and Asian shoppers enjoy fresh sweet corn and apples and Okanagan cherries. In fact, we know that because we export a lot of those crops to those countries. South Asians and Chinese, we knew, tend to buy a lot of raw ingredients, which suggests that they make a lot of meals from scratch. So they should be a customer. They should be a customer who appreciates fresh food, healthy food, and the raw ingredients, they know how to cook from them. We needed to draw attention to the world crops available at the market and work on encouraging diversity. Farmers expanding into new areas and making room at their tables for these new crops. We encourage them to put these crops in a prominent position and use our resources that I'll talk about that we created through the program. For those that are not familiar, Asian crops include things like yu choy, bok choy, gailan, Chinese lettuce, Napa cabbage, daikon radish, Asian eggplant, and bitter melon. We have choy guides that the Hua Foundation created, which were a really great guide for us to start to target what crops we're going to be asking our vendors to produce. In terms of education, that meant introducing our existing customers to those new world crops, and sometimes those crops, I don't know if some farmers have tried them, experimented with those, they can be slow movers. They're not necessarily selling out of bok choy or gailan on a day. So it was a challenge to encourage growers to try those crops. But we knew that they were valued highly by these groups. And we wondered ourselves how we would draw attention to the crops and encourage shoppers to pick up something new at the market. So we were not only just targeting and reaching out to Asian customers, but our current customers, telling them, try something new today, pick up something different, and educating them about how to work with those vegetables. For us, education also meant helping people to understand how our market works. Is it easy to find our information booth for a new shopper? Is it attended and welcoming? Will people easily understand how they should pay for their purchases? Because markets, while they're a familiar concept in many countries, they're not necessarily the same in all ways. And so that was a challenge and something that we needed to consider. It's also, will they understand that products are locally grown, that sometimes they're organic, that they're sold by the producer? Markets come in different forms across the world, so we needed to be able to translate that information out to them and help them understand quickly. And then finally, to grow for us meant growing the audience to grow our market and our vendors' sales. We needed to show growth in sales and shopper attendance for the project to be successful, and for our reporting, for the funding, for sure. We wanted to grow our sales for our vendors and grow attendance for our markets. So what we did was we created some recipes and translated signs. We started by putting together a poster for our 2016 season that you saw on the previous page, and I have a poster here too, that featured some of our Asian crops on the poster, and we used the theme Local Food Global Flavours all year long in all of our market activities, and the things that we did, we saw it through that lens. We thought about how we could infuse our markets with multicultural flavor with every event that we did. We worked with local chefs and vendors to produce a series of recipes that featured the vegetables that we chose to profile through our translated produce signs. So on the right is our produce signs that we worked with some translation services and graphic design to help us create those signs. We put the recipes out at the vendors' booths. We just gave them to the vendors. We put them on pads so that they wouldn't blow away in the market or when it got windy. Vendors sometimes kept them and put them out each week, changed them for other recipes throughout the season. When different crops came in, we moved them around. So we did about a dozen recipes in this format. We also promoted the recipes on our social media, put them in our blog posts, hosted them on our website. So we really just tried to keep reinforcing the recipes, and we made them simple, like they had to fit on one page and be easy. Of course, Asian vegetables lend themselves to quick cooking techniques and are great for busy lifestyles. So just about every green can be sauteed with garlic and olive oil and taste good. So that was an easy thing for us to say to our customers, to say to our staff. Maybe a challenge you could give to your customers is show us how you prepare your Asian vegetables, or choose a vegetable of the week to highlight and include cooking tips and recipes. From what I've heard from speaking with other social media professionals, recipes are key on social media. People love recipes, people tag recipes, they save them. So anything that you can do to highlight a vegetable through recipe is always good. So for the Chinese who settled in Vancouver originally spoke Cantonese, but new immigrants from China are mostly from mainland China and speak Mandarin. In fact, Mandarin has eclipsed Cantonese as the most spoken language in BC, most spoken Chinese language. And Kevin is going to speak more about the origin of the Asian population in BC and some of the factors that have affected how the Asian community interacts with farmers markets. We worked with the Hua Foundation to connect with translation services and designers that could work with Mandarin and Cantonese. And we also learned that from working with Kevin that there's a lot of bad translation of Chinese out there. And you can't always trust Google Translate to be correct. So just be cautious. We provided our vendors with signs they could post at their tent that display the languages they spoke. We found that they were very proud of their other languages and eager to promote the fact up to their shoppers. So obviously we know that vendors are a big asset in a program like this, and you really need to get their buy-in and get their attention, because it's almost always a busy time for farmers. They always seem like there's always something that is taking their attention. So if you can get them to sign on with this program or a similar program where you're trying to help bridge the gap, they can be a very powerful influence on the culture of your market. Vendors who speak another language should be encouraged to do so at the market, encouraged to write signs in their language to accompany their regular English signs, and to help other vendors learn a greeting or a few keywords for a transaction, which can be super helpful. If you have a market staff who speaks a second language, it's even better. And maybe you have them mark somehow, wear a button, or get them helping with translation or whatever. It's super important to know that 30% of immigrants to BC do not speak English. And they'll typically shop at stores where they see their language displayed and feel most comfortable. Many ethnic shoppers will shop at multiple locations. They might a specialty store for some of their specific imported ingredients specific to their culture, and maybe a big box store for staples and other household sundries. Farmers markets offer a unique selling feature of unbeatable freshness, though. And we need to reduce the barriers like language and build awareness that we can be a viable option for their grocery dollar. Including translated text in your external advertising is a big signal. Put it on your poster and your postcards that you circulate throughout your community. We, again, worked with the Hua Foundation to come up with a statement that we could translate and include on our poster and postcards. And that phrase was simply, Vancouver Farmers Market welcomes you to the markets this season. Please come meet local growers and find the freshest produce. That was it. We had that translated into Chinese on our poster and on postcards. We used that when we could and put it in our advertising. It was simple, a welcoming phrase, and it showed that we valued their business. And I have postcards here, and I'm happy to share that translated material if anyone is interested. So in summary, we learned that if we extend ourselves a little by learning a few words of welcome in multiple languages or trying to understand more about a group of customers, those customers will appreciate the attempt. If your pronunciation is not quite right or you miss the mark on something, it really just matters that you tried and you're extending yourself in. And I think that for the most part, they'd be good sports about it. For all retailers, it makes sense to pay attention to a group that could be up to 40% of your community's population. Regardless of demographics, shoppers who feel valued will be loyal and will tell others about your product's exceptional quality, freshness, or taste. That they feel comfortable in your environment is very important. So making these efforts to reach out is worthwhile because we know we have what they're looking for. Canada's 3 largest ethnic groups, Chinese, South Asian, and Filipino, are forecast to make up to 7.3 million of this country's total population by 2031. And that's up from today's 3.5 million. It's time to start thinking of how the changing population will affect your market, and time to start thinking about who isn't currently shopping there. As I mentioned earlier, I've worked several times. I worked with the Hua Foundation on this project. Kevin his help was invaluable to us in gaining a better understanding of the Chinese culture, and we should consider, and the things we needed to consider when we were planning our outreach. Kevin's going to talk more about his work and what influence shaped the ways our Chinese population shop for and sell produce. Thank you.
My name is Kevin Huang. I'm from the Hua Foundation, and we started our organization around 4.5 years ago. We chose the name Hua because it's a play on words in Mandarin, depending on what it's used, paired with. So it can be used in Bien Hua, which means change, Wen Hua, which means culture, and Hua Ren, which means people of ethnic Chinese descent. And those are kind of the intersections of where we work as an organization. And our food security initiative is called the Choi Project, and Choi is the Cantonese word for vegetables. And we've been at it since our launch, and we have worked with great partners such as Vancouver Farmers Market, Oceanwise, some neighborhood houses, and various partners in Chinatown, and including greengrocers, fishmongers, as well as Chinese restaurants. So today I'll be sharing a little bit of history and the global context as to the ways of immigration that we have here locally as immigrant settlers. And hopefully through that, maybe from a more business approach, understanding the audience a little better on how you can engage the growing communities. So, the market culture in Asia is actually still very alive and present day. My parents live in Taipei, metropolis, 24-hour city. And yet there's wet markets and morning markets in every neighborhood. So if you think about that and transplanting yourself to over here in Canada as a migrant, there is that already habitual notion that, yeah, you can get fresh markets. So that opportunity is already there. However, currently farmers markets might not have the type of produce or the language access or other factors that they might not feel comfortable with. So that's something to consider. So from when I visit my parents and other cities such as like Hong Kong, you really see the wet markets as a morning thing and a daily thing. Very similar ways of operating, such as rotating vendors. Like my parents would know which days to get fish, which days to get what, like fresh fruit. They have long-term relationships with a lot of the farmers that are now friends. So they do have that community metrics as well around community building, engagement, and getting to know each other, as well as like introducing each other to new produce and seasonal crops. So it's all there. So wet markets are similar to farmers market style, where it's like they wash it down every day, really. That's why it's like referred to as a wet market. As often it has like protein, like fish and or meat. And then like, yeah, at noon, it's especially in like Taipei where it's humid, it's like really wet because they literally just washed it all and then cleaned it up. And the next day, new vendors come in and it's rotating weekly, but it happens every day. So why is there a disconnect in terms of what we, like Roberta presented already? 43% identify as Asian locally. However, by the survey, it's less than 20% showing up at the farmers market. So there is a existence of a huge parallel food system here in Vancouver, and we live in the legacy of that. This is where our work under the Choi Project has really changed over the past 2 to 3 years, as we learn more about this existence of the huge economy that we don't really have too much data as a food system around. So the parallel food system was really formed starting way back in the early founding of what we call Vancouver. And after the railway and the gold mining, a lot of Chinese that were from the Canton provinces settled here on this land. We have Chinatown today because they were not allowed to own property or live anywhere else. And that legacy of racism really continued into 1921, where Chinese farmers that were brought over for the CPR as well as the gold mining did what they knew how to do best, which was farm. So in 1921, it was estimated that Chinese farmers grew up to 90% of the province's fresh produce. And that's 90, yeah, not 19. So that's a significant amount. And then racism took hold, yellow peril, and white farmers lobbied the government to institute the Vegetable Marketing Act, enforcing all produce sales to go through a marketing board. And due to access, privilege, power, money, the Chinese farmers could not compete with that. So they took that entire food distribution system. So by that time, they have been already supplying most of British Columbia with fresh produce. So they have distribution networks, not just growers, but actually distribution networks out to restaurants and greengrocers. So they took that entire supply chain and formed their own. And throughout the past almost 100 years, there's been various policies against the Chinese Canadian community. including the barbecue meats protest, where health authorities went into Chinatown saying that you can't sell your tashu, so the famous red barbecue meats you see hanging in a lot of Chinese restaurants. And then, on a broader context, there's also the head tax, where immigrants from China wanted to reunite with a lot of the workers that were male were actually not allowed to come over, or they had to pay a fee, whereas Europeans did not. And there was also a period where the Chinese Exclusion Act mirrored from the same policy in the States where Chinese were not allowed to come. So when we think about this constant and long history of racist policy, this is why we have the existence of a parallel food system, because it is a community acting in resilience against attacks of racism. However, the past few decades, as mentioned earlier, there's been a shift in terms of the demographic of Chinese in its broadest sense of who's immigrating into the country. So the waves of migration in Canada locally has been in the early 1800s for the gold mine, 1880s or so for the railway, and then in the 1990s with the affluence of Hong Kong and Taiwan and the handover of Hong Kong back to China from the British, had another wave of migration, and recently it's the mainland Chinese that are coming over. However, we'd also have to look into immigration policy in terms of how the past 2 decades have only allowed a certain socioeconomic class, which is of the high investor class, to come over. And that causes us a lot of challenges in terms of who is, quote unquote, the labor class. I really hate to say that, but like that labor movement. This is just to paint why we as an organization focus on, like, we have 3 versions of the Choi Guide. Simply because we want to provide as much access through all these linguistic dialects. So we have traditional Chinese, simplified Chinese, we have Cantonese, we have Mandarin, and you have Mandarin dialects, and you have minority dialects. So how do you address all of that in a market is a challenge. But I believe that there are those moments where shoppers go for markets for the first time and they go, oh wait, I could read this. That moment is something special, and it would encourage people to come back. I just wanted to point out how in recent times, due to the quick growth of mainland China and the capitalism that has taken hold of global food systems, there's a lot of food scares that are on top of mind for a lot of folks, not just the Chinese, but it is a very real and present scare time and time again around the usage of recycled oil, plasticides in bubble tea. It's okay, local sources are okay. And other types of food scares that are popping up from Asia. And that is something that is, as recent settlers are coming over, they are looking for. And it's in the broader context of farmers market, I believe local farmers, especially getting to know your farmers, is very conducive of allowing that community building, as well as making sure that we rebuild that trust between a producer and a consumer. And how do we do that across cultures and languages? I believe we are on the cusp of trying to innovate and solve. And in the context of Chinatown, because there has been a lot of news around the developments, and this is where a lot of our work as an organization is working with the established traditional Cantonese parallel food system. And through our research, Chinatown has lost over 50% of its cultural food assets. So as end access points such as greengrocers, fishmongers, as well as like barbecue shops, we've lost over 50% in the past 6 years. And if you think about that segregated and parallel food system, where are the growers going? Where are they supplying? Because it is a huge rupture in the entire business chain. This also presents an opportunity to see if there are ways to innovate how they could supply to, say, farmers markets, because I personally believe all the metrics are there. It might just be a language as well as business practice thing that if we're both sides, air quotes here, are able to kind of innovate and work together on, we can find a way to have markets for all. So next would be Farmer Ku, who will be talking about his experiences about being a 4th generation Chinese Canadian. And yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eric, and I'm one of the vendors at the Vancouver Farmers Market. Passion for gardening and the family members who farmed is brought me interest into the business. Farming, for some odd reason, I thought about farming as a high school student. While most other classmates would think about, what video game to play or whatsoever. But anyhow, I am actually a fourth generation Chinese in Vancouver. My great grandfather was one of the many first generation Chinese who immigrated to Vancouver from Canton, China. Some would say the pioneers of Chinatown for the Chinese community. Both my great grandpa and my grandfather had to pay the head tax in order to be welcomed into Canada, I guess, at the time. So you can imagine how long ago my family has been in Greater Vancouver. My great grandpa, along with my grandpa, operated a greengrocer business in the South Granville area of Vancouver in the 1940s. And then alongside, they operated a small farm, which is actually not too far from here, just across the Platello Bridge. I think it's on the right-hand side as you're going south. Farming was much different in those days as, first of all, the climate and weather was much different. They didn't have the experience and knowledge as we do today in farming, that's for sure. I started with Vancouver Farmers Market 10 years ago at the old Trout Lake Community Center parking lot. At the time, I was selling bedding plants, hanging baskets, planters, herbs. We brought some fresh lettuce and spinach that we grew at the time. However, as years went by, with the change of lifestyles, trends, interests, and rising costs of living in Greater Vancouver, I realized, like in any other business in BC, I had to diversify the items I grew and carried at the market. Alongside with what I previously carried, I decided to carry some field-grown fresh flowers, more edible produce, and of course, Asian greens. Let me tell you, it was definitely not easy introducing Asian greens to the market. I still remember the days when no one showed any interest. I would take it home at the end of the day. However, over the past years, along with Local Food Global Flavours, I tried hard to introduce, educate, and share recipes and nutritional value in Asian greens. With the introduction of new signage, awareness in the media, and the Chinese newspaper and local radio, it really brought more Chinese customers attending Vancouver Farmers Market. In the last year, there has been a steady increase. I believe there's still lots of room for growth. Many customers gave me the recommendations on what to grow, feedback. Did you have a certain item that you grew for yourself? Could you share some with us? That sort of thing. There was a lot of items we never brought to the market. We just grew for the family. And we slowly started bringing them and sharing the fresh produce with them. In my stall, I would always place Asian greens very close to my till, as I could make recommendations and answer questions immediately when the questions came up. Simple ways to prepare the Asian greens, whether blanched, stir-fried, touch of salt. Popular greens would be named gailan, which is Chinese broccoli. Yu choy is sometimes also called choy sum. We also carried one called dao miu, which is pea tips, strictly the tips of a sugar pea kind of sugar snap pea, just the tips. We'd also carry baby bok choy, Shanghainese bok choy, We carried one called an on choy, which was greenhouse grown specifically. They would also call it water spinach. We also carried one called a hong yin choy, which is a red spinach, which was also required to grow in the greenhouse because we don't have the temperatures as and the humidity as China would or in the Asian areas. We also carried Mizuno, tatsoi, which also very popular. The daikon has been very popular. Siuchoy Napa cabbage, and also one I was pretty surprised people were interested was the Kolei cabbage. I believe a lot of growers in the Lower Mainland is actually growing this Kolei cabbage. It's kind of like a frisbee-looking cabbage, not as dense as a traditional cabbage, sweeter and more tender. Excellent in a sauerkraut. Okay. If you haven't tried, definitely come see me at the Vancouver Farmers Market. I'm usually always there. Just ask for me, and someone will direct you to my stall. I would also like to comment the word choy, meaning is the meaning of a vegetable, like green. Also, Asian customers are always looking for the word miu, which is miu meaning baby. They're always looking for baby greens. Baby greens were believed to be more tender. So we'll see you at the upcoming summer markets. Hope to see everyone there, and come by and see us. We're a very good group, and we try really hard to provide a good experience for everyone. Freshness is always the key at any farmer's market. Sometimes wilted vegetables from the summer heat can sometimes be the tastiest if prepared right. Give it a try, and that concludes my little information session, I guess.